in my ear. Okay, well, welcome everybody on this first wonderful snowy day of spring. Uh, I'm, I'm glad we're on Zoom. I was beginning to think we should have done this one in person, but the snow is still falling and it's accumulating, and that's very unwelcome. But you're all welcome here, so thanks for joining us. Just quickly run through a bit of club business. We've set our first, or possibly our second, club outing of the year. The first one is kind of up in the air right now, but we do have Waterfowl Day at Tiny Marsh scheduled for April 12th, 2025 at 10 a.m. And we'll meet at Tiny Marsh at the Trotterdijk parking lot. We did this event last year and it was insanely windy and cold, and still a hardy bunch of us went out and viewed waterfowl. This year it's kind of touch and go. Is the marsh going to be thawed out or not? We don't know. Or this recent weather is making it look good. Anyway, come out and join us at Tiny Marsh on April 12th. And a bit of other club news. We've signed on to sponsor the Couchiching Conservatives Passport to Nature. We're an event sponsor. We get to sponsor a single event, and we get a club ad printed in their booklet and promos on their website and social media. Last year, the Passport program connected with almost 600 people directly, and they printed 4,000 copies of a full-color booklet that features the events and ads from sponsors. The booklet is distributed throughout our region. Events and activities are free or low cost, thanks to the support of local businesses. The Couchiching Conservancy has joined the Midland Penetang Field Naturalists in showing our support for the great work they do in the natural spaces that we love. Most well known as the Carden Plains, which we visited quite often, but there's also other local ones like Grants Woods. So we felt this was a good cause to support, and we've signed on to them. Copeland Forest is another great spot, and just an announcement that they are hosting their AGM on Saturday, April 5th at 10 o'clock at the Heights of Horseshoe Ski and Country Club. And their guest speaker is none other than Bob Bowles. Also having an AGM is the Couchiching Conservancy. Their AGM is on March 29th at the Hawk Ridge Golf and Country Club at 1151 Pearlwood Lane in Severn. And that's about all I have. I want to remind people, as Ken did, if you haven't renewed your membership or you haven't joined, do so at treasure@mpfn.xyz. And after the speaker is done and we've done the Q&A, hang around and we're going to do nature sightings at the end. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Ken to introduce our guest speaker. Ken?
Yep, give me a second just to find the right buttons to push here, Bob.
Yep.
No, where's Sarah? Let's see, here she is. So welcome everybody, and welcome Sarah Cox. Sarah is joining us all the way from Victoria, BC today. And I'll just tell people a bit about her, and then we'll turn it over to Sarah. Sarah's she's an award-winning author and journalist from Victoria. Sarah won the Science Media Centre of Canada and the Canadian Association of Journalists Award for Environmental and Climate Change Reporting. She writes a lot of things for the Narwhal, a very interesting established magazine in Canada. And her most recent book is called Signs of Life, Field Notes from the Frontlines of Extinction. It was published in April of last year. As an environmental journalist, Sarah has witnessed what happens when we drive species to the brink of extinction. In her book, she tags along with the Canadian military, Indigenous guardians, biologists, conservationists, and ordinary people who are racing to save hundreds of species before it's too late. Through the eyes and work of individuals who are bringing species back from the precipice, Sarah delivers both an urgent message and a fresh perspective on how we can protect biodiversity and begin to turn things around. And that's what she's going to bring to us tonight. But I thought I'd let people know that I was put on to Sarah's book by one of our speakers from last year. He was an in-person speaker for us, Edward Strusek, another fine Canadian nature author. He wrote a recent book about all the wildfires out there. And this is what Edward had to say about Sarah's book. In this very fine book, Sarah Cox writes hard and unflinchingly about the ethics and difficult choices that have and need to be made to slow the rapid extinction of so many species. There are unlikely allies here, such as the Canadian military, and many strategies, such as preserving genetic material from endangered species. The book is never a rant. Each strategy, every story is presented with balance and clarity. And that's, I think I've read the book myself, and I think that's a fair assessment. I think it's a book that every Canadian should read. And now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah to tell us a bit more about it.
Thanks so much, Ken, and thanks for having me to speak to you tonight. I'm always happy to do anything connected to Ontario. I grew up mostly in Ontario, in Toronto and Kingston, and it's nice to be there even virtually. It's also nice to be presenting on Zoom because at one recent event I had, someone thought that they would have an outdoor event for the nature writers, and it turned out to be the day of an atmospheric river in BC. So nice to be warm and dry tonight. And I wanted to talk a little bit about my book. I'm going to throw up a few slides of some of the critters that I talk about and then open things up to questions. And the book, Signs of Life, here it is. It started with a press release that came my way, and this is how my intrigue about how we're treating species at risk in Canada began. I wasn't really thinking about endangered species in Canada. It wasn't on my radar at all, but the title of the press release really caught my attention, and it was titled Opportunity to View Rare Owl Chick. And the press release said that there were fewer than 20 spotted owls left in Canada's wild, but that I could watch Canada's most endangered owl on a webcam, and not just one owl, but a pair, and their newly hatched chick. And it said if I were lucky enough and clicked on the link, I might be able to see the chick being fed, though of course there were no guarantees. And so this was very intriguing to me because I had heard about spotted owls, as many of us had, and associated them with battles to protect old growth forest in the Pacific Northwest, mostly in the 1990s when they were in the media quite a bit, but I really had not heard anything about them since then. So I did click on the link. I didn't see very much, but a splotch of feathers at the bottom of a hollowed out stump. But then I dug into it a little further and found out that these owls were living in outdoor aviaries at an experimental spotted owl breeding center in BC's Lower Mainland. And I say experimental because it is the first time, it is still the first time that spotted owls have ever been bred in captivity. Their eggs were being hatched in incubators in a lab called Artificial Ink, while forest sounds played in the background. And my curiosity only deepened when I learned that the breeding center was being paid for by BC taxpayers to the tune of about $4 million. And this had flown completely below everybody's radar. So it was the BC government that was funding the center. And I'm going to attempt, because unfortunately my internet has been a little wonky today, so this may or may not work, to show a few slides. And I'll show you one of a spotted owl about 10 days old in the captive breeding center. Now, is that working? Can you see it?
Looks good, Sarah.
Okay, perfect. So, and this is the same government funding the breeding center to the tune of $4 million when I first looked into this, that has an agency called BC Timber Sales, which was busy auctioning off some of the last old growth forest and critical spotted owl habitat. And this was forest that scientists deemed essential for the survival and recovery of the spotted owl. which is a species that, of course, has evolved with the old growth forests of the Pacific Northwest, and where it nests largely in cavities and old growth trees. It shelters in the shadows of these mature rainforests, and it preys primarily on other denizens of old growth forest, flying squirrels, and bushy-tailed wood rats. So after some effort, I wrangled a visit to this breeding center, where I learned that in 10 years of operation, despite the best intentions and much hard work on the part of biologists and other staff, the center had successfully hatched just 8 spotted owls, and one of those owls was blind and couldn't fly and laid eggs in her water dish. This was not the first time that I had come across very expensive and very elaborate measures to try to pull a species back from the brink of Canadian extinction or extirpation at the very last moment. That same year, I had visited a First Nations-led project in BC's Peace region that aims to resuscitate a highly endangered caribou herd called Klinziza, named after a sacred mountain. And the First Nations had taken matters into their own hands after the BC government failed to act. To try to save this caribou herd from winking out, they hired vets and helicopters, and they captured female caribou in the mountains, which was a very elaborate process. Biologists were strapped to helicopters, balancing on skids, firing net guns. Instead of a bullet, it shoots out a net. And then when the helicopter lands, they sedate the caribou, they blindfold them, they monitor their vitals to make sure they're not going to die from something called capture myopathy. They truss them, they put them in a body bag, they fly them to the top of the mountain, and then they take them by snowmobile to a pen that they had built with money that they themselves have fundraised. And in the pen, the pregnant female caribou were fed hair lichens, which is this particular herd's primary winter food. And the hair lichens were hand-picked laboriously by volunteers. And the caribou were kept in the pen until their calves were old enough to stand a better chance of surviving in the wild when they were released. And as with spotted owls, at the very same time that these quite extensive efforts were underway, aiming for recovery with absolutely no positive outcomes guaranteed, the BC government was continuing to sanction destruction of habitat for this same caribou herd and other highly endangered herds, including habitat destruction for the Coastal GasLink pipeline, which you may have heard about because it sparked Canada-wide protests in early 2020, just before the pandemic hit. And that pipeline will send fracked gas from BC's northeast to a new LNG Canada export terminal in Kitimat, BC on the coast. And among many other impacts, the Coastal GasLink pipeline destroyed habitat the BC government had supposedly set aside for caribou recovery. And road building and clear cutting for the pipeline in habitat for one endangered caribou herd called the Heart Ranges meant that wolves could more easily access the caribou and prey on them. And so the solution, and I say this with quotation marks, that Coastal GasLink and the BC government came up with was that Coastal GasLink would pay the BC government $170,000 to shoot wolves that might access the caribou through industrial disturbances. And this was part of $1.5 million the company was paying the BC government to monitor caribou and predator like wolves. And at this point, with these kind of two stories in hand, I began to collect stories about other intensive 11-hour efforts to try to save species at risk right across Canada. Things like using electrical currents to extract semen from wood bison, chilling it in a walk-in cooler and flying it from Saskatoon to Toronto on Air Canada, where scientists at the Toronto Zoo were waiting to inseminate a female, or surgically implanting Vancouver Island marmots with transmitters and keeping the equivalent of a stud book to pair male and female marmots in an effort to enhance genetic diversity, or breeding black-footed ferrets at the Toronto Zoo to send to a ferret boot camp in the United States, where only those that pass muster will be released into the wild. cloning black-footed ferrets. Yes, cloning is now a thing in endangered species conservation, albeit a controversial one. And celebrating the birthday of a cloned black-footed ferret in this picture named Elizabeth Ann, with a birthday cake made from minced meat, kibble, mice, and prairie dogs. I also came across things like shooting one species to save another, again with save in quotation marks. The BC government and Alberta government have killed thousands of wolves in the name of saving caribou, most shot from helicopters, some using a Judas wolf whose radio collar leads sharpshooters back to the pack. And the BC government has been quietly shooting barred owls as well that have moved into spotted owl territory, especially as spotted owls disappear. The federal government, for its part, has been shooting cormorants on a tiny island in the middle of Lake Erie that is part of a national park. I understand from Ken that many of you are bird watchers and have spent time in Lake Erie. And this is not the greatest picture, but it's one I pulled off the internet of cormorants being shot near Middle Island in Lake Erie. As part of my research for the book, I had asked if I could go out to witness a barred owl call and a wolf call, and I was denied. But I did end up going out on an observer boat to witness the cormorant call in Lake Erie. And cormorants themselves were threatened with extinction just a few decades ago, as I'm sure many of you know, largely due to DDT, but they've made a comeback. And in part because they have plenty of food in Lake Erie in the form of an invasive herring species. But now their guano is killing endangered Kentucky coffee trees and other vegetation on tiny Middle Island. Ironically, these are the same species of trees that human activity has virtually erased in southern Ontario. So now, after human activity has killed many of the trees in the Carolinian ecosystem in which they're found, we are now killing cormorants. And I did get to witness that firsthand, which forms the basis of one of the chapters in the book. As I learned more about Canada's approach to endangered species conservation, something was not adding up for me. I realized that we are not doing very much to help species at risk of extinction until the situation is so dire that they are in danger of winking out imminently, and then suddenly they become a priority, and then suddenly large amounts of time and money are invested in trying to turn things around at what is really the very last minute for the species. And at the same time, we're neglecting to take action to help other species that are also in trouble, including species in the same ecosystems. And they are declining to the point where they will soon be in the equivalent of an ICU in nature. We also aren't even following our own laws to protect wildlife. Across Canada, we have a whack-a-mole approach to endangered species conservation, and largely it isn't working. So I'm going to talk about a little bit more about the grim scenario, and then I promise, get to some hopeful things. I was a little shocked to find out that across Canada, we have 5,000 wild species at some risk of extinction. And they include everything from slugs and slime molds to wolverines and whales. They include species like caribou and wood bison, which are central to Indigenous people's ways of life. They also include more than 100 at-risk species that are found nowhere else in the world but in Canada. Species like the Vancouver Island marmot here on Vancouver Island, where I live. And almost 900 of those 5,000 species are critically imperiled, meaning they could soon be lost. At one point, my book title suggested by a friend was The Dead Species Society. I changed that to something more hopeful, and my publisher thought that that might not be very good either to strike such a grim tone with the title. But that is really how I was feeling after finding out all this information about how Canada deals with species at risk of extinction and how many there are. People think of Canada as a bit of a natural wonderland. That's how we're viewed from other countries. And indeed, you know, we do have a lot of nature left compared to many other parts of the world. But in the last 5 decades or so, over my lifetime, we have seen nature diminish, biodiversity diminish, and more species become at risk. And of course, one measure of how healthy biodiversity is how many species at risk of extinction there are. So in the book, I try to answer some questions that I asked myself over and over every time I came across another one of these somewhat eye-popping efforts to save a species at the last minute, usually while we were continuing to destroy the very places that the species needed for their recovery and survival. And some of those questions were, why can't we take action to help endangered species before the 11th hour when they're already in the equivalent of nature's ICU without much chance of long-term survival? Don't we have laws to protect species at risk of extinction? So what are we doing wrong? And more importantly, how do we turn things around? So again, I will get to the hopeful stuff, I promise, but I want to dig into the question, don't we have laws to protect species at risk of extinction? Because this is something I hear over and over again from people. Everybody's somewhat incredulous, like, don't we have laws? Aren't there legal mechanisms? How could this situation get as bad as it is? And so let's do a quick journey through how well our laws have, or in this case, have not helped and protected the spotted owl, which is really a poster child for Canada's failure to protect species at risk of extinction, and really a symbol of British Columbia's failure to safeguard enough old growth forests to protect wildlife and biodiversity. So meet the spotted owl. Can you all still see it on your screens? Can someone give me a thumbs up? Maybe Bob, you're right there. Ken?
Yep, we've got spotted
Great.
owls on the screen, a pair of them.
Great. So the spotted owl is about the size of a football. I used to describe it as being about the size of a chicken, but a spotted owl biologist told me that that was demeaning to the owl, and I should not compare it to a chicken. The spotted owl has been on the planet for about 115,000 years. So that is before the human species Homo floresiensis, which was about 1 meter tall, lived in caves and used stone weapons to hunt food. It's one of 3 subspecies of spotted owl. And of course, you might remember back to the 1990s during debate about logging when restaurant menus in American mill towns, because this was an issue south of the border as well. So restaurant menus in American mill towns had mock spotted owl soup, and stores sold t-shirts and bumper stickers with the slogan, "Save a logger, eat an owl." In BC, which is the only place in Canada where the owls have ever been found, we used to have about 1,000 paired adult owls. So about 500 pairs, about 1,000 adults, not including juveniles and chicks. But as industrial logging erased many of BC's old growth forests, the spotted owl disappeared as well. And in the 1980s, scientists realized populations were in steep decline and sounded the alarm. In 1992, Canada's Species at Risk Act was passed, and came into effect, I think, at the beginning of 1993. And at that point, the spotted owl was listed as endangered. So you would think at that point, you have a species, in this case, the spotted owl, that has been listed as endangered under the Species at Risk Act. You would think that action would happen, that people would click into doing things to try to protect the owl and reverse the decline, but that did not happen. And one reason why it didn't happen, I want to kind of try to illustrate through a story, which is that for the book, I interviewed the former head of the Canadian Wildlife Service, and he recounted the parable of the elephant and the 3 blind men, where one of the men feels the elephant's side and says it's like a tree trunk. Another feels the trunk and says it's like a snake. And the third touches the elephant's side, and the third touches the ear and says it's like a fan. And this former head of the Canadian Wildlife Service told me that in the Canadian version of the parable, two people are in the room and they are watching on this, they're looking at this scene and they are bickering. And he explained that these two people are Canadians and they are arguing about whether the elephant is a federal or provincial jurisdiction. So with the owl listed under the Species at Risk Act, you would think that further harms against it would be prevented. So here's what actually happened. The Federal Species at Risk Act, Canada's Species at Risk Act, unlike the US Species at Risk Act, only applies automatically to federal land. And in Canada, that's about 4% of the land base. In British Columbia, that's only about 1% of the land base. And it includes national parks, military bases, post offices. If the spotted owl were suddenly to evolve to nest in the eaves of a post office in Canada, it would be protected automatically. So to stitch together the rest of the safety net for species at risk of extinction in Canada after the Species at Risk Act was passed almost 30 years ago now, the provinces signed an accord. I guess it is 30 years ago now. The provinces signed an accord agreeing to safeguard at-risk species on provincial land. But 4 provinces and Yukon didn't follow through with that commitment, including the 3 Western provinces. BC still has no standalone law to protect at-risk species. Neither does Alberta, nor does Saskatchewan. And provinces that do have laws, like Ontario and Nova Scotia, often fail to enforce them. So what that means is that environmental law charities like Ecojustice have to go to court time and time again to try to force governments to follow their own laws. So as the spotted owl declined, Ecojustice looked for ways to take the BC government to court. But in fact, there were no laws in BC that could be leveraged to protect the owl. And there still aren't, because the BC government reneged on a campaign promise in 2017 to pass endangered species legislation. So in BC, legally, a tree with a spotted owl nest can still be chopped down as long as the owl isn't actually in the nest at the time. There are several provisions in the federal law that allow Ottawa to step in if the provinces are failing to safeguard a species at risk of extinction. One is an emergency order, which gives Ottawa the power to step in and take responsibility for things that normally lie within provincial jurisdiction, such as, for example, whether or not to issue logging permits in critical spotted owl habitat. But of course, the federal government is reluctant to step on the toes of the provinces. And in the history of the Species at Risk Act, it has only done this twice. It has only issued an emergency order twice. Once for the western chorus frog in Quebec, and again for the greater sage grouse in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And so as spotted owl populations declined and clear cutting in the owl's habitat continued, Ecojustice petitioned the federal government to step in and with an emergency order. And only at that point in time did the BC government spring into action to do something. It said it would protect all occupied spotted owl sites and establish the captive breeding center to enhance the population. So it took some of the remaining owls in the wild out of the wild and put them in the breeding center for a founder population. And that included the last 3 known spotted owl chicks to have hatched in Canada's wild a few years ago. And the BC government also promised to identify and protect spotted owl habitat, but then years went by without meaningful action. So when the BC government approved logging near Canada's last known breeding pair of spotted owls, the pair that had hatched those 3 chicks, Ecojustice and an environmental group called Wilderness Wilderness Committee, again filed for an emergency order. And lo and behold, once again, the BC government sprang into action and it deferred logging in 2 valleys near the nesting pair. At that point, the federal government promised an action plan to protect the owl's critical habitat. And at that point in time, that action plan was 13 years overdue. 2 years later, an amended draft recovery strategy was published. There's a whole saga about missing habitat in that, which I'll skip over for now. And subsequently, a draft recovery strategy was released just over a year ago. And so here we are, many years after the spotted owl was listed under Canada's Species at Risk Act, and still there is no final recovery strategy. And logging continues in wildlife habitat areas in BC that have been set aside for the owl. At the breeding center, things haven't gone so well either. When the breeding center was first set up, scientists thought, well, we've bred peregrine falcons in captivity, we've bred California condors in captivity, we'll breed spotted owls in captivity. Well, it turns out the spotted owl does not like to breed in captivity, and it is still very difficult to hatch spotted owls in captivity. So the population has barely grown over many years and millions of dollars invested. And this is just one species in one province, and a fairly charismatic species at that. And we all know that it's much easier to drum up support for protecting a species that people look at and think, oh, that's so cute, or what are known as charismatic megafauna. It's not a bat or a slug or one of the species that are very small that people don't really notice or care about. And so there are many other issues with the federal law as well. Decisions are too often political. They're not science-based. It takes a long time to list a species. I work for the Narwhal, and we published a story earlier this week about a project in BC, and how a new pipeline project, and how in the early stages of construction it had been cited for environmental violations and was facing a substantial fine. And one of the reasons it was cited for environmental violations was because the company building the pipeline failed to survey for 2 species of bat. And so the reporter working on the story we did a quick Google. I was the editor on the story, and one of the species of bat popped up as endangered. So we published the story saying that this one species of bat was endangered. But lo and behold, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, COSEWIC, had listed it as endangered 2 years ago, but the federal government has still not got around to putting it on the list. So that's another issue that people ran into time and time again, trying to get protections for at-risk species in Canada. Most species that are listed under the Species at Risk Act continue to spiral downwards. There are very long delays with recovery plans, years and years and years. And I used to be able to point to south of the border as an example of an approach to endangered species conservation that, while not perfect, is far better than our own. The Endangered Species Act in the United States covers federal, state, and private land automatically. And again, that's not to say it's perfect, but it has been credited with saving dozens of species from extinction. But now, of course, we have Trump, who has directed federal agencies to look for ways to bypass protections for endangered species, including on forest land. And now we have tariffs and expedited resource projects, in BC at least, that are now suddenly exempt from environmental assessment, which means that we may not even know the harm that we are causing to species at risk of extinction before the harm is done, much less be able to mitigate it. So at this point in time, with so many at-risk species, it's very difficult to deal with things on a species by species, with a species by species approach. It seems that it is too late for this in Canada. And so many scientists are calling for an ecosystem-based approach, which has been promised but has not yet materialized broadly, which is not to say that some species, like the spotted owl, for instance, may not need their own attention, but if we wait all this time to list species and bring them through the process and spend lots of money on them, again, it's more of this whack-a-mole approach. It's not actually moving things along to a better place for the majority of species. So where, you might ask, do we find any hope in this rather grim situation, which of course is being made grimmer by all the events happening south of the border and the impact on Canada? And so when I started this book, I was determined to find hopeful stories as well as despairing and eye-popping stories. And one place where I did find hope was on Canada's military bases. And I visited 2 prairie military bases where biologists and others are working to safeguard species at risk. Among other things, base biologists, and there's one on almost every Canadian base, and others are advising the military on how to time maneuvers so that they don't disturb at-risk songbirds during nesting season. I learned that tank maneuvers can even mimic the traditional role that bison have played in the prairie ecosystems. And at CFB Suffield in Alberta, the military is working with the Calgary Zoo to try to shore up burrowing owl populations. So I went out with folks from the Calgary Zoo for a day on CFB Suffield. You can see my driver there, Corporal Master John Bain, in the picture, and he volunteered for this mission because he was interested in the burrowing owls. So the way the program works between the military and the Calgary Zoo is that biologists take the smallest burrowing owl from out of the nest in the fall or in the late summer, and they take them to overwinter at the Calgary Zoo, where they get mice delivered, and then the following year they're released back to the wild. And the idea of taking just the smallest owlet from every nest is that they stand very little chance of surviving in the wild. And so with the boost from the Calgary Zoo, they stand a better chance when they are released the following spring. And on CFB Suffield, the military is involved in digging artificial burrows for the owlets, or at this point in time, they're fully grown. And so I was able to go out and see how they were released, and they are released. You can see, I don't have a pointer, but if you look at the owlet in the hand of the man with the Wilder Calgary Zoo cap and green shirt, you can see a little like antenna sticking out. So the owls are released with little backpacks to track them, because biologists are trying to figure out where the owls are going, running into trouble on their migration, because many of them are not returning to their nesting grounds as they normally would. So to release the owls, they're first of all, they're not given their mouse ration on the day of release, so they don't get car sick. They're driven to CFB Suffield. They're examined. They are affixed with this tiny transmitter. They're tagged and tracked, and they're released into the burrow with a ration of frozen mice that the team calls mousicles, because their tails stick up like popsicle sticks. And that's a photograph from biologist Jared Hobbs of a burrowing owl. They're, I don't know if anyone's seen a burrowing owl. I can't see nodding heads when I'm sharing my screen, but they're quite tiny. They're only about, I don't know, 9 inches high or something, and they have really long legs. So another tool that we have at our hands to try to turn things around for species at risk is that researchers are costing out recovery plans. It's absolutely nonsensical that we will list the species and eventually, after many years in some cases, have a recovery plan, but there's no price tag attached to it. And so we don't know how much it will cost. But thanks to a group of researchers led by Tara Martin at the University of British Columbia, efforts to protect species across an ecosystem are being, price tags are being affixed to them. And so, for example, if you take the Fraser River estuary, which is home to 102 species at risk of extinction, that's kind of the big river. If you've ever flown to Vancouver, you would have definitely flown over the Fraser. It's right by the airport, kind of a muddy looking river. And the researchers found that by addressing threats to the Fraser River estuary ecosystem as a whole, it would cost $15 million a year, or only $3 a year for every person in the province, to give every single one of those species a greater than 50% chance of still persisting in 25 years. They also found that if we continue with business as usual, 2/3 of those species have a less than 50% chance of still being around in 2050. And I think most people presented with that information would say, yes, I will pay $3 a year. I want the government to pay $3 a year on my behalf to still have species like salmon and whales in the Fraser River estuary. And this same team of researchers has also done costing for species recovery in other provinces as well, including Saskatchewan, Ontario, and New Brunswick. Working on the book, I found countless numbers of people who are doing everything they can, largely in the face of government inaction, I have to say, to help species at risk of extinction. And they include Indigenous communities and scientists and lawyers and ordinary people who are taking action to protect one little patch of habitat for wildlife, or mustering forces to try to save one particular species in their community or province. In Northwest Alberta, there's a First Nation that has a stewardship program called the Caribou Patrol. And Indigenous guardians literally help a migrating woodland caribou across a busy highway on their twice annual migrations, a highway where the caribou were being hit by cars and trucks. In Ontario, you might have read about people who call themselves plover lovers. Maybe some people on this Zoom chat are actually part of that group who get up early in the morning to go to a beach and prevent tourists and locals from trampling the nests of plovers. In southern Saskatchewan, I talked to ranchers who are putting their cattle out to pasture on native prairie grasslands later in the season, so at-risk songbirds that nest in the grass can fledge their young. And one group, the Saskatchewan Stock Growers Association, is working with ranchers to put conservation covenants on their land and stitch together remaining native prairie grasslands through private ranch land. And on Vancouver Island, an association of wetland stewards built an underpass to help red-legged frogs and toads and salamanders and newts cross a busy highway during migrations to and from breeding grounds. And that project, I love the name, it's called SPLAT. I loved it even more when I found out that it stands for the Society for the Prevention of Little Amphibian Tragedies. So I really came to believe, working on the book, that it's action at the local level that will most immediately make a big difference. I tell stories from different provinces, and one of my favorite stories is from a woman, Nina Newingham, in Nova Scotia. And so Nina is a writer and a gardener, and was reading about how mainland moose are now highly endangered in Nova Scotia. I mean, to the point where the Nature Conservancy, I might have that wrong, it might be Nature Conservation Society, but there's a group there that has a moose sex project where they are trying to get people to call a number when they spot a moose so that they can match female and male moose. And so they have little buttons with kind of a moose face on it and little hearts dangling from the antlers. And they're passing those out so that people will know to call if they actually spot a moose. So Nina saw that people in Nova Scotia were trying to protect some of the last forests of moose habitat in Nova Scotia. And she went out with a bunch of other people and winter camped to try to save these areas, which she described as not even, particularly stunning old forests, but just what was left, because so much has been logged in Nova Scotia, and 80-year-old forests. And in one forest, what she and her fellow campers did was that they decided one day as they were camping to go see if there were any endangered lichens in the forest. And Nova Scotia actually does have an endangered species law. And so, which they had leveraged successfully before to protect an area from logging that was important for migratory bird nesting. So they went out into the forest and they looked for lichens, and they weren't sure if they were going to find any. But lo and behold, they found some occurrences of endangered lichens in the forest. And so they let the provincial government know that. So the provincial government sent in their own biologists who found even more occurrences of endangered lichens in the forest. Because Nova Scotia does have an endangered species law, it meant that a buffer zone had to be placed around each and every occurrence of these endangered lichens in the forest. And by the time a buffer zone had been placed around them all, it was uneconomical to log the forest. So that's just like one example of how people on a very local level are taking action to do something to help wildlife in their own community. Oh, this is, I didn't really talk about Vancouver Island marmots, but maybe I'll close with this. This is Vancouver Island marmot getting surgery in a tent on a mountain on Vancouver Island. And this is a bit of a success story as well in endangered species conservation, because we almost lost the marmot about 20 years ago or so. And through absolutely heroic and expensive and ongoing efforts, the marmot has been pulled back from the brink of extinction and populations are growing. It involves a very somewhat elaborate matchmaking process where they keep stud books, they test the marmots, they take their DNA, they try to make sure that one marmot isn't too closely related to another marmot. Marmots are bred at the Calgary and Toronto zoos and shipped to Mount Washington, where they are released with these transmitters like the one that's being implanted right now, so that biologists and others can track them and see how they're doing. And the head of the Vancouver Island Marmot Recovery Program described the matchmaking to me as like the seating arrangement from the wedding at the wedding from hell, because they can match make all they like, but if the female doesn't like the male that she has been matched with, she will not accept him or breed with him. So again, a very detailed, elaborate effort to try to pull a species back from the brink of extinction. There you go. There's the marmot up close. But again, a success story. And so I think actually, given the time, I think I will throw things open to questions. I'm very happy to take questions about the book or writing about endangered species. I'm just looking in the chat now for the first time to see if there's anything that I should pick up from there.
Well, Sarah, I think I forgot to tell people to put their questions in the chat as you go along. So if you got questions, everybody do that now. You can also raise your hand. There, I think you look at your screen, there's a way of raising a virtual hand that we will see, and then turn the floor over to you. You can unmute yourself and ask your question. But I know Dorothy got into the chat there, and I think you just wanted to know, we're in locally here, we're all very close to a story that's been happening. Some local individuals worked with the Simcoe County Forest, with the county level of government. And her question is, have you looked at Ontario ecosystem bills for species at risk? Young jack pine for Kirtland warbler near Midhurst Berry. And she also mentions the Curve Lake First Nation Black Oak Savanna near Peterborough. These are all kind of local stories. With the Kirtland warbler, it's been a big success. They work with the Simcoe County foresters to create the type of habitat that Kirtland warblers need to breed, and they successfully attracted a few males to the area. So I don't know if you have any comments on that.
I did come across that. And then the dilemma that I had with the book, I had 12 months off work, which was basically 12 months to do all of the research and the writing and the travel arrangements and the travel. So there was only so much that I could include. And that was one of the stories that I had come across, but just wasn't able to include in the book. So it did sound like a really interesting and positive story of species conservation, again, at a very local level.
It is
Well-
pretty new too, so.
Yeah, and unfortunately, unless we succeed in turning things around, there'll probably be room for a sequel to the book. And John just asked where to buy your book. Now, I know we spoke to the people here in Midland at Georgian Bay Books, and I think they were trying to bring some in. If they haven't done so already, they can certainly order for people. But any other comments about how to get the book?
Yeah, just online. I always tell people, go support your local bookstore owner. Ask them to get it. If not, it is, on places, you can get it on places like Amazon or Kindle or Kobo, places like that. But I personally am a big believer in supporting local bookstores.
What was the publisher's name again?
It's Goose Lane.
Goose Lane Books or whatever. So I think most bookstores can probably bring it in if they don't already have it. And you should probably tell them to get more than one copy, because a lot of people will want to read this book. While people are figuring out whether they want any other questions, I might just ask a couple of my own. You spoke briefly about, I think as smug Canadians, we all think we're so much better than the Americans in so many ways. But it really seems when it comes to species protection, there's something about our form of government that makes it slightly less effective than what has been done in the States in the past. But I know there's lots of concern for what might be happening down there in the future. Do you want to address that at all?
Yeah, so again, like, things change quickly, right? I can't actually believe how much the world has changed in the short amount of time since I wrote the book. And now it almost seems that I was writing about at-risk species in Canada, and now with kind of, I'm going to get into politics a little bit here, sorry, but with Trump demonizing Canada and talking about annexing Canada, it almost seems some days as though Canada and Canadians are themselves at risk. So things have changed really quickly. And here again, I can speak mostly to BC. I think that the tariffs, the trade war, the economic uncertainty are all providing an unfortunate opportunity to cut out environmental assessments in BC, for example, to fast track projects without fully knowing the impact on the environment and biodiversity and species, without putting mitigations into place to help those species and the environment. And I am very concerned about what is coming at us. South of the border, I can't pretend that I have kept up with everything, but it is a total onslaught as Trump goes after the Endangered Species Act and talks about drilling in the Arctic Wildlife Refuge and cutting down forests that have been protected. I know that environmental lawyers in the States right now are much in demand, that groups that take the government to court to try to get it to follow their own law are hiring more lawyers right now. Again, it seems that this is already providing in Canada a bit of an excuse to bypass already weak processes that could do something to help our growing number of species at risk.
And I think you mentioned in the book, like we're all kind of worried whether the administration in the states will abide by laws. But their laws, when they do have species protection, they seem to apply to both federally and statewide, whereas not the case in Canada, which seems to be the source of a lot of our problems.
That's right, because so yes, in the states, it automatically applies to federal, state, and private land as well. Whereas in Canada, it automatically applies only to federal land, our species at risk law. And so it really behooves the provinces to step up, which for the most part, they haven't done, as I mentioned, either through not following through with any legislation whatsoever, or in BC's case, having a mishmash of legislation that has so many gaps in it, it doesn't do much of anything at all to help any species at risk. Or yeah, no legislation, or my understanding is that Doug Ford has taken a bit of a scissors to Ontario's species at risk legislation as well, which used to be held up in Canada as kind of the gold standard for other provinces wanting to pass endangered species legislation. But again, I think we're at this point where this one species by one species approach, it might have worked 30 years ago when the legislation was passed, but it's not going to work now because there are way too many species at risk of extinction. And so we do need this ecosystem-based approach. And unfortunately, it does not seem to me that we are headed towards that in the current political climate.
And yeah, instead of whack-a-mole, we need to kind of protect the land that these people need. Somebody asked the question, do you feel nature conservancies are the best way to save habitat for species?
I think they're a great tool, like one of many. That in the absence of the government stepping in and protecting species, thank goodness we have nature conservancies.
And I think part of that too, it covered in your book a fair bit, is that if, in terms of reconciliation, truth and reconciliation, if we gave control of a lot of this land back to its original owners, the First Nations, they seem to be doing a better job of actually caring for it. Would you agree?
Yes, in many cases. And so one of the things that I get into in the book is, in the more hopeful section of the book, is looking at Indigenous protected and conserved areas, which are really taking off across Canada right now as a way to protect not just wildlife, but also ways of life. There are, I mean, obviously, Indigenous people don't need studies to show this, but there are studies that show that biodiversity is greater on land managed by Indigenous peoples, even greater than in national parks.
I'm sometimes amazed, and I'll go back to the other questions in a minute, but you know, there's a whole chapter in your book, I think you call it the God Squad, about that deals with a lot of the legislation. It just seems to me that our government seem to pass laws just in order to either ignore them or break them. And it's amazing some of the extent that their lawyers will go to avoid the laws. You told the story about a lawsuit for the marbled murrelet, and I think it was under the Migratory Bird Act that their nests would be protected, but the bird doesn't build nests. What was that story?
That's right. So this is another case where Ecojustice, an environmental law charity, has taken the government to court to try to get it to follow its own laws. And so the marbled murrelet is a species that it's actually a seabird, but it nests on the branches of these great, huge old growth trees on BC's coast. And it doesn't make a nest. It just lays a single egg in a depression on one of these very large branches. And so Ecojustice took the federal government to court to try to get them to follow the Migratory Birds Convention Act, to which Canada is a signatory. And the court actually ruled that Canada wasn't following the act. And this is all fairly recent, I'm not sure what has happened since then, if there have been changes, but there was definitely a positive ruling for Ecojustice in that case, I am not aware that it has led to the protection of any old growth forests in BC where marble murrelets lay their eggs at this point in time.
And I think another story you cover is how, I think by reading from the book, the government says the hands of the clock, I think they have about a, was it 9-month window to respond when COSEBIC makes a recommendation for an endangered species. Government says the hands of the clock can't move until cabinet receives an assessment from the environment minister, leading to years-long delays for some species as assessments gather dust in virtual filing cabinets. COSEBIC will make the recommendation, but the minister just sits on it.
And this, we learned this week, has happened with the silver-haired bat, because that was the bat in question for the narwhal story that I mentioned. So COSEBIC assessed the silver-haired bat in 2023 as being, or they may have actually even assessed it earlier. It went to the federal government in 2023. Here we are in 2025, and it's still not on the list. Still not on Canada's species at risk.
And Elaine here asks, Elaine, what's an EAC volunteer? Tell us, you can put it in the chat. I don't know what that stands for. But Elaine asks, do you have ideas about how to get people to care? Any examples of novel ways to get the non-engaged public to pay attention? Well, you talked about this a bit with some of the groups down east.
Yeah, so I think too, like what I really came to realize is that, again, it kind of goes back to that old saying that people care about what they know. So people tend to care about what is in their own backyard or their own province or their own community. And I think that is a really good way to engage people. I did a presentation a week or two ago on Quadra Island, and a biologist in the question period, a biologist who I hadn't met before on the island, put up her hand and said that she was assessing at-risk species on private land on the island and was kind of like volunteering her services to do that. So if people wanted to know what at-risk species were on their private land, she would go in and do a bit of an inventory. And of course, if people know that those species are there, many people are going to make sure that they protect the habitat on their own private land. So I think a lot of it is just a lack of knowledge, and it's made much more difficult to get the word out there to people because the media in Canada has been so gutted, and local media has been so gutted, and Facebook, of course, and Instagram, you can no longer post links to articles about anything at all. So it's a big challenge to get the word out, but I do think that local level action is something that does engage people, and people do care about their own yard and their own neighborhood and their own community, even if it's, I mean, most people will never see a caribou in the wild. I've never seen one in the wild. I've only ever seen one in a pen. So again, for most people, the idea that there are all these species, like 5,000 of them in Canada out there, it's very abstract. But bring it down to the local level and it starts to become far less abstract, and people feel far more invested in things.
I think our club got involved on the local level here a little while ago about some of the area around Little Lake that's being threatened with the development. And, you know, we got kind of deep in the woods with all these environmental assessments. And it always seems, and I think you have some in this book, that they can do anything as long as they have a mitigation plan. And they stress mitigation. We can destroy this piece of the environment, but we'll make it better somewhere or other. But there never seems to be any enforcement or any review of the mitigation. And 9 times out of 10, the mitigation doesn't seem to happen. Anyways, EAC is the Environmental Advisory Committee. Any other questions from anybody out there before we wrap things up? Well, before I turn it back over to Bob, just Sarah, hold up your book again and give everybody a good look at it.
Sure.
So they recognize we see it. Well, there's signs of life. What is that on the cover? Is that a feather?
It's a drawing. It's a beautiful drawing, actually. It's kind of like the ocean, it's a feather, but it's the water, the trees, and birds.
It's everything, yeah.
Yeah,
Field notes.
I didn't do it.
I like that title, the what was it, the Dead Species Society, but I think your editor was probably right. But anyways, thanks for a great talk. And before I turn it back over to Bob, I just might conclude with a quote that you mentioned in the book. It's a very inspiring quote I think we've all heard before from Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of individuals, of thoughtful, concerned citizens, can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So we'll promise to keep up the fight and see if we can't turn things around. Over
Okay,
to you, Bob.
thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. I thought that was great. I'm a little bit sadder, but you did give us a little bit of hope towards the end. I just finished reading an article in Smithsonian Magazine that talked about early recognition of the fact that species were going extinct. People didn't believe that could even happen. And the thrust of this article was it was the American Ornithological Union would actually shoot endangered species. The ones that were closest to becoming extinct, they were the most highly sought after, until one fellow, and I've forgotten his name, changed the whole thing and turned it around to a genuine conservation movement. But I mean, it's people's attitudes to the wildlife that's bringing this about. And I don't know how you go about changing it. Sometimes I just despair about it.
I have
Anyway,
sometimes I despair too, but on the other hand, I don't really want to sit in despair. I feel better when I go out and do something. I feel better when I go spend time in the natural world. I'm a big hiker, and I always feel better after a hike. And
yep.
Yeah, so it is easy to despair, especially in these times, which seem to be getting worse by the day. But I think just the little things help.
Anyway, thank you again.
Thank you.
I guess we're on to nature sightings. Has anybody got any nature sightings that they would like to share with us? Ken suggested if you have any photos that you may want to share with us, you can share your screen and talk about your wildlife sightings.
I might try to go first, Bob, if that's okay.
That's okay by me. Somebody's got to start.
Yeah, and I'm going to try to share my screen here. Because it's that time of year, lots of things are coming back. Can everybody see my first robin of the year?
Yay!
And actually, you know, I'd heard they'd been back for about a week, but I kept looking, I couldn't find one. Finally, I was down in Tiny Marsh. I saw a flock of about 60 of them, all by the Tiny Marsh Nature Center. So they came in flocks, but there seems to be lots of them around now. Didn't see too many through the winter. Whoop, what happened?
You're on the cackling geese.
Yeah, but I lost it somewhere there. Let me just see. There we are. Okay, yeah, went over to, you know, before our bays open up, it always seems the Collingwood Harbor seems to open up a little and stay open through a lot of the winter, although it did freeze completely over this winter. But we went over a week or so ago because there was more open water over there. And I saw a nice little group of cackling geese, a little smaller than our Canada geese, a little stubbier bill, kind of a blunt forehead. And if I had Canada geese in here, you'd see that they're much smaller. Cackling geese aren't much bigger than a mallard duck. And we had great looks at a few canvasback, which is one of my favorite, one of the prettiest ducks. This is the male canvasback. And then I've got a photo of the female canvasback here, along with the ringneck duck. That's in Collingwood. And bluebirds are back. This is in Penetang. Where I saw them, I just saw 2 males. So again, I assume, Bob, the males come back before the females. They don't travel together.
The males seem to be a bit weird that way. They like to face the tough weather and prove their manling. I suppose that's how it works. I don't know, but
Yeah.
they're obviously staking out nesting territory.
And I think we were talking earlier about all these big farmers' fields that are now farmers' lakes around Tiny Marsh, and One of them gave us some nice looks at some greater white-fronted geese. The hunters call these speckle bellies. I think the speckles, you really can't see them here, are on the front of the belly. But kind of an unusual geese there. When you get a flock of like 5,000 Canada geese, it can be hard for us to pick out the 2 or 3 greater white-fronted geese because they do blend in with the Canada geese very well. But if you can pick out that orange bill, if they're standing on the ground, you see bright orange feet. And the white front refers to that little bit of white behind the bill. Killdeers are back. This is at Rotary Park in Penetanguishene. Had a pair of them there. Collingwood Harbor has some long-tailed ducks. Lots of northern pintails around right now. And again, some of these big lakes have thousands of northern pintails, male on the left, female on the right. I got very elegant duck. And again, they don't always show that long pintail. I think that's, are they losing that now or gaining it? I think they're gaining it now, aren't they? Heading up to the breeding grounds.
They should be in their breeding plumage now, no?
Well, I think some of them are just coming. Sometimes we get a lot of males that don't have it. I think they their breeding grounds are more in the prairies and northwest of us. A pair of sleeping redheads, male and female. And this was our nice find yesterday. I think Bob got to see this goose too. It's a Ross's goose, a little smaller than the regular snow goose. Stubbier bill, no grin patch, no black mark on the bill. And it's funny how Ross's geese always seem to be much cleaner than snow geese. Why is that, Bob? They're always kind of a nice bright white, where the snow geese are always kind of mud covered. Or
I think Ross must have been more fastidious than the rest of them. I don't know.
they're picky eaters, or they just they don't roll around in the mud like the snow geese do. That's the Ross's goose. And this is a snow goose, but when it's a dark morph of the snow goose. Most snow geese are all white, but quite a few of them have a black body with a white head. And when they're a snow goose, but we tend to call them a blue goose. And earlier this week, song sparrows were back with flocks of them, all sorts of them around now. Not necessarily singing yet, but they're certainly in everybody's gardens again. And they kind of they're overlapping right now, but in the winter we have the tree sparrow, which looks a little bit similar, but it would have a bicolored bill and not quite as marked on the chest. It has a little, but the tree sparrows will soon leave us and the song sparrows arrive. Lots of tundra swans around in our big lakes right now, but often they only give you distant looks. There were a few of them over in Collingwood Harbor that were giving nice close-up looks, and then you get to see that little golden teardrop coming from their eye. So I think that's all I've got. Who else can tell us something about what they've seen?
Well, if nobody else wants to go, I can tell you about my sightings, and I can even share my screen. But everybody's seeing all these birds.
I have to stop sharing, then you can go ahead.
Okay, well, everybody's talking about all these great returning migrant birds, but my story is a little more domestic. 2 days ago, we saw our first chipmunk here in the yard, so they're waking up from their hibernation. So
well,
I was thrilled by that, but not everybody's thrilled to see a rodent, but I am.
I had two chasing each other around.
I have a sighting.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Sunday, I'm sitting inside in the study and hear this noise that I've never heard before. Went out. I've got no pictures, guys, so you have to believe me. It was a merlin flying round. It got a male, a blue-grey back and stripes on its tail. Yeah. And it was going berserk outside. I don't know what was bothering it, but that's what my iPad picked up. My merlin on my iPad picked up that it was a merlin flying. Yeah. But yeah, it was really noisy.
Yeah, they're noisy birds. Were other birds bothering it by any chance?
Yeah. There were crows and blue jays and other things outside. So I don't know what was going on, but yeah, it was. Yeah, it was. But I've got no pictures, no evidence.
We believe you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Come on, everybody. Somebody else must have seen something.
Or trumpeter swans are back at Wymarsh, and red-winged blackbirds too.
Yeah, lots of those around, and the
Yeah.
grackles.
Yeah.
And of course, I always say the real first bird of spring is the turkey vulture.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
I had a big fallout of grackles. That always happens at this time of year for me. My whole lawn is covered with about 200 grackles.
Oh, yeah.
That happened this afternoon.
Yeah.
Aren't you
Yeah.
lucky, Kate? Anything else you see?
You keep the grackles down there, Kate, because they mob my bird feeders.
I know people don't like black birds of any kind, but I like the grackles. I think they're a nice bird. So
Yeah.
Yeah, nice iridescent purple sheen to them sometimes.
I like them too, but sometimes you get too much of a good thing.
Yeah. Well, it was nice to see. I mean, I don't think we see nature in plenty enough.
No.
When you think of what the passenger pigeon used to be like. So I'm really happy when my whole yard is covered with a bird.
Yeah.
Well, if nobody objects, I don't mind sharing some photos of my recent sightings.
Yeah, let's go for it.
Okay, I'll go ahead and hopefully I can do this. Share my screen. That's not what I want to watch.
You have to highlight the screen you want.
I'm trying to find it now. Oh, I don't believe that's it. None of them. Well, this will do. There we go. You see that?
Well,
Yep.
we see again. We click on each individual picture, maybe, and then
This is a glaucoscule.
no. Right now, Bob, go full screen with it, because right now we just got your whole file.
I don't know what to do here.
Can you expand it, or
Try double clicking on it.
There you go. Thank you. Does that work?
nope?
Didn't work. Well,
Go
let me
back.
get
Now that you've double clicked on it, unshare and then try to share again. Maybe you'll see it. Stop share and try again and see if you can find the full picture.
Let me get this up first.
Guy has got a pileated woodpecker with a juvenile. You think so? Seems.
Well, not this year, obviously, but he's smaller. He's much smaller than his parents.
But it wouldn't just be a hairy woodpecker with a pileated?
Oh, no.
'Cause the juveniles wouldn't be hatched yet in our area, I don't
Well,
think.
then could he be just last year's offspring?
Just, I think there's a bit of size difference between the males and females.
Well, there's 3 of them, and they're at my feeder maybe 5 times a day.
Hmm.
And the younger one, or the smaller one, comes right onto my veranda and starts pecking at the wooden columns.
Maybe you're not feeding them well enough, that particular one. Make
Oh,
sure
no, wait a minute. I spent a fortune this winter. Woods on suet.
They've been known to have assistants for the next year. That would be the years young from before. So the young bird would probably be assisting them in their nest.
Could be. And then they're just one. I wasn't sure there'd be that much of a size difference, but could be, I guess.
Probably a young female.
Yeah. How are you making out, Bob?
Well, I'm ready to try again if you are.
Sure.
So let's try this. And this is the bird I want. There. Can you see that?
No, again, we just see we see all the pictures. You haven't gone full screen with one.
Let me try this again. Stop share. Share screen.
But you have to have a screen with a full picture on it.
I'm not seeing it though. Let me try this again. And then I'm going to give up. Okay, so there.
Well, don't give up, Bob.
No? Well, I like the encouragement, but
Yes.
it's not working for me. So
We should have practiced this in dress rehearsal.
I guess we should have. See,
Just
when I go
tell
full
us
screen,
about
though,
them. Just tell
When
us
I-
what you saw.
Yeah, you'll
No,
do
no,
that.
that's not the same.
Give
So,
it one more go. Then
One
three
more-
strikes and he's out.
three strikes and I'm out. Okay.
Yeah.
Share screen. There.
Yay!
Oh, there
you
he
did
is.
it.
Yay.
You did it.
Yay. So that is a glaucoskull. At
And
the
I
Tiny
didn't
Barge
see that
Downline
glaucoskull
Pond.
yesterday.
Pardon me?
I didn't see that glaucoskull yesterday. I looked all over the field for him.
There were two, and they were really close to the Ross's goose.
Yeah.
Um,
I look for him more at Floss Road 6, but
there's your Ross's goose. He's nice and clean. I've caught a picture of him foraging. Another one, a little bit of a shimmer from the sun and the wind, but not a bad photo. There's your snow geese. They're kind of out further, mixed in with the Canada geese.
and there's how many? Go back on that one, Bob.
I could see 5 in this one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I think this is one
But
down here.
that one sleeping looks lots of pretty dark for. I think it is a snow goose, but it's quite is it almost
one
a
here?
goose? Yeah.
No, I think they're snow geese. They're all about the same size. Ross's goose again. Got him doing a wing stretch.
Ooh, big stretch.
Yeah. Double crested cormorant.
There's a nice bird of spring. And of course, it's open season all year round on those in Ontario now, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. That's the call that Sarah was talking about.
But here on this photo, you can see the double crest.
Yes, and that's not very common. They don't often show that. So this one, obviously, I'm going to say is a male, and like all the other males, they get back early. And come on. This was down at the Concession 6 pond. I managed to catch a flight photo of the Ross's goose. Cute little bathtub squeaky toy. There he is again.
And look how clean he stays. How does he do that?
I don't know.
If I spent my whole life in a swamp, I'd be filthy.
I certainly wish somebody would tell my dog how to do that. There's another one. There's one of your greater white-fronted goose. That was down on McKinnon Road.
Now here you can see the speckle belly, I guess.
The speckle belly you were talking about, the orange legs, the orange bill, the white face. There's another poor photo. But they're rare, so it's worth any kind of photo.
Bob's got the big lens, so you can tell how far away some of those birds are.
Yeah. There's the first bluebird of spring. We saw this one down on Lawson Line. That was about almost a week ago now.
A cute little guy.
Isn't he cute? Yeah. Gotta love him. Red-tailed hawk. This was, I almost forget where this was. Oh, yes, there was a great gray owl that showed up not too far away from that Concession 6 pond on the 7th concession. And hopefully this next photo will show you that. There's the great owl. This thing was right beside the Elliott Road. It was no more than 25 feet away from me. I had to zoom out to frame the bird.
Yeah, now there's been a few great grays around this winter. And of course, a lot of people have heard the news coverage of this hawk owl.
Yeah.
Look at those nice yellow eyes.
Managed
we actually heard of a boreal owl in the area, but that one was a very short stay.
Yeah. Managed to capture a couple of flight photos. Not the greatest, but that's always nice. There is he just about to take off here. He or she. I shouldn't say he because I don't know this for a fact.
You got great focus on the eyes in these shots, Bob.
Yeah, that's what they say about wildlife photography. If the eye's not in focus, the rest of the bird won't look in focus.
But look at that one. You can see, go back to that one. You can see how around the eyes, the feathers act almost like a radar dish. And this is they figure that their ears are I think the feathers direct the sound to their ear. They hunt mostly by sound.
This little thing here disturbed me. It's almost like he's got a porcupine quill sticking in his face.
Might be a stick or a bone or something.
I don't know what that is, but it was bothering me. Obviously, it wasn't bothering the owl. There he is. Well, he captured a vole. He was just about to eat it.
Of course,
Yeah.
the other really neat thing when you do have these birds fly around you, there's absolutely no sound. Their feathers, you can't hear a thing, no rustle at all.
This isn't a great photo, but I took this one because I was really interested to see the talons. You
The
don't
feather
normally
talons, yeah,
Yeah.
which is usually a sign of a northern bird.
There he is. He had just finished pouncing on his vole, and he's mantling it. Raven with sticks. This was down at Port Severn. That's a sign of breeding.
That would be for nest building summer.
Yeah. A few of these.
Or maybe just courting a female. Sometimes they just
Could be. He came over and he broke off like a half a dozen sticks off of this. I don't know what kind of tree. And I was wondering what the plan was, but he eventually flew off with one of them. And it was interesting to see the white wings on it, the white feathers in the wings. These golden eyes in the Severn River playing around the current. I think that was pretty fascinating. A couple of long-tailed ducks down there. Those are the first ones we've seen of those these years. That's also Port Severn. Wabashine, there's been a barred owl that's been hanging around the Tay Trail for most of the winter. We've seen it about half of the time we went there. So it was pretty reliable. And here's your hawk owl. Now it looks close, but I was probably 50 meters away from this bird when I took the photo. So I wasn't crowding it. I was giving it its space, despite what the Owl Foundation will tell you. A bit of it was singing. I've never heard their voice before, and it was really a thrill. There was so much traffic noise there that it wasn't worth trying to make a recording, but it was really cool to hear her vocalizing.
maybe it was telling everybody to buzz off.
Possibly, but he seemed totally uninterested in the people that were around.
Probably not.
And starlings on a cross. And that's what I have for nature sightings. I'm going to stop sharing. Anybody else?
Don't be shy.
Going once, going twice. All right. Well, I guess that's the end of the meeting. Can remind us who our guest speaker is next month. We're live and in person at the Y Marsh.
Yeah, and I'd have to look up his name because I think we advertised one speaker. And
we had Aaron Rusak was supposed to be speaking with us, and I understand he can't make it.
Yeah, Aaron Rusak is from the Georgian Bay Conservation Society, and he's being sent out in the field next month. So we got somebody else from the same group. They're going to come to speak to us about the work they're doing up in the kind of in the Muskoka area. And it'll be a lot about the species of risks that they're working with there, and about a corridor project that they're working on in that area, which should be, we've had other people speak to us about the importance of corridors, and they're looking at creating a corridor along the shore of Georgian Bay for wildlife. So before, a lot of people left already, but before you leave, if you want to put any thanks or comments that we can pass along to our guest speaker tonight, feel free to do that. And we'll see everybody. I'm going to let the meeting run for a few more minutes, and then we'll stop the recording, and we'll see everybody next month in person.
And let me thank you, Ken, for giving us such an engaging speaker on such an important topic. Thank you.
And everybody, really, her book is a delight. Well, in some ways, it's not a, but it's a very engaging read, not hard to read at all, on a very important topic. So buy it, get your library. I've taken to buying most of my books as ebooks. They're a lot cheaper that way, but also you don't clutter up your bookshelves, and you can read them in bed at night without disturbing your significant other, because it's you don't have to have a light on. And so I recommend that. But if you like hardcover books, it's really you won't regret adding this one to your collection. So good night, everyone.
Good night, Ken. Good night, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you and good night, Ken and Bob.
Good
Good
night.
night.
A super talk. Thank you so much.